tous. Merci de vous installer.
Please take your seats. Thank you for being here this morning for this round table. I know it's extremely hot in this room, but you'll see. I'm sure we'll manage to hold a discussion. I have lots of wonderful guests here to talk about poverty and the fight against poverty. We have a lovely panel with Stéphane Carcillo, who's a member of the Cercle des Économistes. The question is to see how we can eliminate poverty. We have any number of experiences and testimonials from other countries. We have a panel which is very diverse. How can one eliminate poverty? What are the state policies? We talk about this a lot in France. How can we get the right benefits to the right people? What are the levers we can use? I'll introduce people quickly. Stéphane Carcillo, who's an economist with the Cercle des Économistes. He also works for OECD. He was an economist for IMF, and he's worked in a certain number of ministries. He's very familiar with employment policy. Next to him, we have Carole Al-Sharabati, who's research director at Surin Associates, professor at Beirut University. You can tell us what's happening in Lebanon, for example. Thierry Baudet, president of CISA, which is the Economic, Social, and Environmental Council, which brings together a certain number of stakeholders like trade unions and representatives of employers. Adrien Chaboch, General Delegate at Emmaüs International. Emmaüs, of course, is a community created by Abbé Pierre about 70 years ago. Velia Vidal is a writer and a social entrepreneur. As you can see, we'll be able to start the discussion. Please take your seats. And Stéphane, maybe we could start by talking about poverty in France. What are we talking about, 9 or 10 million people? Well, thank you, Fanny. I will try and give an introduction to set a frame for the discussion without giving you too many figures. Poverty in France, well, it depends on your criterion. It's relative poverty. Poverty is defined compared with the average revenue. People are poor if they're under 50 or 60% of the average income. 60%, that's an income of 1,100 euros for one person alone. Of course, when you have children, you get much more money. The RSA for a single person is 600 euros today, so that doesn't fill in the gap between 600 and the poverty threshold. It can increase a lot with people who have children, but the needs are much greater, of course, when you have children. To combat poverty, the first idea one could have is that you need to increase welfare benefits. We could increase benefits and get more people out of a state of poverty. But hardly any countries do this, not even the northern countries, which are the models for fighting poverty. Why? Because there has to be an instigation to get back to work. Work has to pay enough compared with being unemployed. You have poor people who can work, for example. What's difficult when combating poverty is to give enough resources to those who, for various reasons, cannot find another job. You need to increase the support for people like that. Whatever the case may be, these people won't be able to work because they're handicapped, they're too old. You have psychological problems, there's a child minding problems. You give a minimum to people who can work to encourage them to take up a new job. So I think it's an interesting topic. Now then, in terms of monetary fights against poverty, a lot of people who are entitled to this support don't ask for it. The number of people eligible for benefits but who don't ask for it is 60%. So 35%, one-third of people don't ask for these benefits. So whence the automatic payment of support. If support is automatically paid, you could lower the poverty numbers because there'd be fewer people who don't receive the benefits. But as I said, the problem of poverty is not just a problem of monetary welfare, it's a problem of access to jobs. In France, in other countries too. The fight against poverty, the fight against recurrence poverty, getting people sustainably out of poverty, consists in enabling these people to find a job. 6 out of 10 households are poor when they have children if neither parent works. 2 out of 10 households if one parent works, 1 out of 20 if both parents work. In other words, work, the intensity of work, the number of hours worked per month, because some people work part-time, that counts a lot when it comes to emerging out of poverty. Went to the debate. What should we do to help people to find a job again? We have these non-monetary barriers. It's not a problem of inciting people to take a job or not giving them enough aid. It's the people can't find a job. I have a young child. I don't have anyone to take care of the child, so I can't work full-time. Or the work is too far from home. Or there are jobs that they are too far away from where I live, and I don't have any means of transport. I don't have a car. Also, there may be a problem of skills. The people lack key skills. Maybe it's a problem of housing. For housing near to my work, housing benefit, but if I change locations, I'll lose my social housing. So it's a question of mobility, it's a question of housing, it's a question of child minding. This is very important if we are to combat poverty in a lasting way and if we are to enable people to get a long-term job. So you need properly to coordinate all these policies. Went this reform, France at work, there's a debate on the activation of social benefits, make these social benefits automatic. Some people lack skills, they need to be sent for training, etc., and so forth. These debates are very long-standing ones. The idea is to enable these people to get back to work because that will help them emerge from poverty. That's my view in a nutshell. I'll give the floor to Thierry Baudet. The CISA has talked about this for many years, and you've been focusing on poverty. You might like to round off what Stéphane says. What have you identified? We have the social partners who are giving thought to the matter. We have representatives of civil society who are thinking about it too. Can they also provide a solution? Well, the first thing I'd like to say is that the fight against poverty is a matter that must be taken up by society as a whole. The body politic and society must all wage this battle. This idea was mentioned in the 80s. CISA at the time published its views, and our founder said that poverty is not a question of people who need to be treated in an isolated way. Poverty is a violation of fundamental human rights. And I think that this is very meaningful. In other words, nobody deserves to be poor. I don't think we should talk about the poor and those who deserve something better. I think that what politicians say today is a bit ambiguous in this respect. Say you just have to cross the road to find a job or go around the old port in Marseille to find a job. I think that's rather aggressive in terms of this ambition where we say that poverty is a question that must be dealt with by society as a whole. We now have poorer workers as well. For example, household health, the conditions aren't the same if you're in Paris or in the Corrèze, a rural area. So this is a problem that needs to be taken up by society as a whole. Being poor, it's a question of money, granted, but it's not just a question of money. If you're a single parent, you may not be able to solve the problem of education or child minding, and therefore you can't go out and work. You can't cope with unexpected expenditure. You may have a health problem and you don't have access to care. You can't use the internet for private purposes. You can't meet with friends and family to have a drink or invite them over for a meal. So poverty should be part of all public policies, employment policy, but not just that. And the third idea I'd like to mention in the course of this first statement is that I think, when I said it's a matter that behooves society as a whole, I think that in many countries, or in our country, we seem to accept some kind of house arrest in terms of jobs, housing, schools. 100,000 children leave school without a proper diploma every year, and we're not doing much about it. Now, what about the neighborhoods? We've just tried to recruit teachers, and we can't recruit enough teachers in sectors where there's in big cities. If you look at the Seine-Saint-Denis, with the teachers who aren't being replaced, between the beginning and ending of school going, because there is a lack of teachers, children miss out on a full year of schooling. So we need to combat poverty, and I think the whole of society should be engaged in order to enable people to lead a decent life. I'm not going to be very formal. The women will speak after the men. I think it's important for Adrienne Chabot to take the floor, because in the Emmaüs Foundation, you're there in the field. And what you've just heard, is that your daily experience? Yes, it is. And above all, that enables me to give you some concrete examples. Let me take the case of a person who's an Emmaüs companion at present. This person is self-employed in building, earns his a living, about 9,000 euros a year. But the person lost all his income because one of the construction companies didn't pay him. And when the person asked for a benefit, the answer was, no, you earned too much money last year, you don't qualify. So he sleeps in his car, and luckily this person now is with the Emmaüs community. Say someone finds himself in a precarious situation, the answer given is not immediate. The answer given by the state is not unconditional. There's no trust. Now, if we have public policies, and I think that's the case over the past few years, which continue to see precarious people as a potential cheater, and if they view the person in that light, then we'll never succeed. Whereas if we say to the person, yes, we understand you're in a difficult situation now, today, we'll give you the means to become independent once again, then things will work. There may be some fraud, but these frauds will be marginal compared with the social and economic benefit, because that person won't become extremely poor. That's a key testimonial. We need to show trust, welcome people unconditionally. That's what Emmaüs does. People say, okay, you're Emmaüs, it's easy for you to do that, but that's what we do. In other words, a person knocks on our door and says, I don't know where to go, I don't know where to live, I have nothing. And we say to that person, well, here, you can sleep there. We don't ask for the person's CV or tax declaration for the preceding year. And that's what Emmaüs is all about. And I'd like to say another important thing. At Emmaüs, we really believe that work is a source of dignity. All the people I've met in my life, well, no one wanted to live an undignified life. I'm deeply shocked when I hear people saying that there are people who don't work because it's their choice, it's comfortable for them. At Emmaüs, we believe this is not true. People want to have dignity. People want to live off their work. And that's why we propose truly solidarity-based economic activity. It's not a question of just distributing economic benefits. You need to create local job opportunities which will enable people to work and do some meaningful work, because that also is important. You want to live off your work, but you don't want to work to live. It's not the same thing. Creating an economic activity can have a great local impact, and that's the kind of thing we need to develop, in my view. Yes, indeed. Work, the way you view these people, Thierry Bonnet, you talk about social acceptability. I'd like to ask this question. We're very fortunate here to have a very diverse audience. I'd like to ask the question to Velia Vidal. How do things work in your country? You're a writer, a social entrepreneur. How do you view poor people? Do you get used to poverty more in your country than in Europe, for example? For those who need translation, please take headsets. I'll be speaking Spanish, so the time has come to take up your headsets.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, good morning. I'm very happy to be here with you today. Thank you very much for the invitation. And we have our former minister, Cecilia, here. Cecilia Lopez was the former Minister of the Environment in Colombia. I've been in London for the past 3 months, and so I have been learning English for about 40 years. I go to a school where most of my companions are very young. They're about 20 years old, 18 or 19. There are French people, Germans, Italians, and people from a number of countries in the Arabian Peninsula. There are also Japanese, Chinese, and people from the Far East. In one of the first classes, we looked at economic terms and poverty. At the time when we were explained what poverty was all about, and people said, well, these are really, really poor people, and a lot of people said, no, that doesn't comply, that definition, with what these people are. In another class, we talked about the worst inventions of humanity, and I said that in my view, one of the worst inventions of humanity was the luxury industry, diamonds, gold, and my companions said, well, what's bad about that? And I realized that they didn't know what happened on the other side of the Atlantic, on the other side of the Mediterranean. Poverty, well, the way you view it is very different in America, and particularly in Latin America. It's very different indeed. That doesn't mean that we are accustomed or grow accustomed to poverty. Not at all. One should never become accustomed to poverty. We know full well what it means to be poor or not to be poor. The fact that we live in a given region. Well, I come from the Pacific coast of Colombia, and there are other people from different regions. There's one of the very biodiverse regions in the world, but one of the particular traits is that in Latin America in particular, we have the greatest density of African people. Over 80% of the population is black. And second, we have a large indigenous population. Numerically speaking, in Brazil, they are more numerous, but there are no other places, no other cities with such a density of Afro-indigenous populations. The percentage is extremely high where I live. And also, we suffer from a multidimensional poverty. We are perhaps the most poor in Colombia. We have figures when it comes to food security. Surprisingly enough, the 5 departments with the highest rates of hunger, serious hunger, they have a very high concentration of Afro-indigenous people. What I'm trying to say here is that amongst all the general causes of poverty, because we should talk a lot about Latin America, I think we have to realize that it is necessary to include the ethnic perspective as a difference. You cannot have a poverty elimination policy without eliminating racism. And that has to be understood as applying not only to Latin America, but to Europe as well. You have to incorporate this dimension. You have to incorporate this racist dimension. Thank you very much. One never grows accustomed to poverty. Whether you look at it or not, you never grow accustomed to it. I'd like to turn to Carole in Lebanon. How are people trying to reduce inequalities? Because that's an issue too. People say that France is full of inequalities, but it's less unequal than many other societies. Over to you. Thank you. In Lebanon, poverty hit us 1 or 2 years ago. It's the third crisis in our contemporary history, and it led to all sorts of bankruptcies. And currently, today, we have 50% of the population living under the poverty threshold, 25% under the extreme poverty threshold. They earn less than $1 a day, and they live off less than $1 a day. What's interesting in Lebanon is that this situation was sort of sought after, almost. It was triggered by a regime which lives off this. It lives off this mechanism for many years. Subsidies applied, but were given to the richest. They went to the businessmen. They went with the wealthy. The retirement scheme, it seems to benefit only 2% of the population. So some alternative had to be found, and a quick alternative, a quick fix. That's why Lebanon opted for cash transfer. This is a cash transfer mechanism every month, which goes to the most needy families. Whence the great challenge? In a corrupt country, which is on the verge of bankruptcy, there's no state apparatus per se. How can you get the money to those who need it most? The challenge was huge because there were elections underway, and during elections people buy votes. It's at that time that a group of young people decided to bring together modern technical means, and they set up a digital system which has digitized the entire supply chain for distributing benefits to the poor. It starts with outreach and selects the people, filters them, household poverty is measured, and then payments are received. This system has become totally automatic. We use prediction models which enable us to assess the degree of poverty of individuals and households. And in the space of just 6 weeks, they thus managed to include 100,000 people in the program. Another 100,000 will soon be joining in the months to come. What's interesting here is that combating poverty in Lebanon consisted in combating a corrupt regime which feeds on poverty. A new social category, young people who were completely outside the decision-making circle, infiltrated, so to speak, the system and state institutions using new means, which successfully skirted the official system, and young people thus were able to enter into play. So that links up with the theme here, hope. There's a huge hope because the young people bring tech, bring artificial intelligence, and this helps us to settle the problem of poverty. Technology, therefore, used to reduce poverty. Maybe we could go back to this topic. There are a number of obstacles that need to be overcome. You gave one possible solution, which gives rise to a lot of hope, and that's the theme of the Rencontre this year. What are the other solutions, perhaps, that one could envisage? even in our country. Stéphane earlier on explained that an experience was underway because there are a lot of people who don't ask for support or benefits. People don't get these benefits. They don't ask these basic benefits. Yes, the government has said it will look into the matter. Stéphane, is this what we've just heard, a positive potential solution? I think automatic welfare payment based on income is a very good solution. We now have the IT tools in France. We have the infrastructure that would enable us to do it. We didn't used to have this infrastructure, and I believe that will be very beneficial when it comes to helping those people who have a sudden loss of income. It's a bit like what you were saying, in that we're working in the right direction. So technology can help us to target the right people at the right time. I believe that this is not sufficient, however. Paying out a benefit and saying, well, there, I've given you this benefit, that's enough. Well, I don't think that is sufficient. The experience of less developed countries than France, which give benefits, is very interesting. Lebanon, for example, Colombia, Mexico, and Brazil. It's very interesting to see what these countries are doing. There's a human presence in the cities, in the neighborhoods, in these countries, which have a lot of poverty. The idea is to identify the obstacles, what prevents people emerging from poverty, family by family, house by house. There are actual visits. In Mexico, for example, people go from house to house and they have a tablet in order to evaluate the situation. And the idea is to provide really targeted assistance based on the obstacles that have been identified. There are a lot of things you don't actually see, but if you're there on the spot, you realize that people are in abject poverty, or they have material difficulties, or on the contrary, they have just passing difficulties, temporary ones. So in addition to what you talked about, making benefit payment automatic, we need to have an integrated service to help poor households, particularly poor households with children, and single-parent households in France in particular. This is the population where France is not doing very well. In France, we do a lot to help the poor, but for single-parent families and young people, we're doing less well than in other countries. And I think we need to have an integrated service which will make it possible to mobilize the health services right away, the social services, the young child services, the housing services. Our services are very disseminated. They don't coordinate together, and that in itself is a barrier when it comes to eliminating poverty better in our country. Earlier on, Adrienne Caboche, you talked about the way we look at people who are poor. Nobody wants to feel that he doesn't have any dignity, cannot access a job. What changes have you perceived? When you give a helping hand, what's most useful when it comes to helping people?
Well, I believe that the main point would have to be to have a global approach and not to give an answer on one aspect of poverty. As you said earlier, the cash distribution is very important, and I don't want to challenge that. But now, if you just think that's enough, you are nowhere. Because apart from the issue of money, there are other barriers, other obstacles. Emmaüs is a bit special, but when you get to an Emmaüs community, you find a job, housing, a decent community, and people who are going to help you. If you have children, your children will be taken care of. If you want to take them to school, you have retired volunteers who can take your children in their car to take them to school and bring them back in the evening. And this is something that happens in the communities and that doesn't exist in the public services in the territories. And you have to remember that poverty is not just an issue of money. There's a lack of access to healthcare, to culture, to quality housing. If you live in a place that is absolutely not isolated and you have to put the heating up in the winter and it's also remaining in poverty. So you have to really imagine things at local level and think about each area, thinking about what are the various forms of poverty, and not look at things in silos. At present, there's a lot of discussion about the payment of a lot of issues about the payment of the minimum revenue, and there's been a lot of tension socially. Do you think we should put prerequisites for these supports? Should we reduce the family subsidies for the families where the children, for example, demonstrate and cause problems? Thierry Baudet, what would you say to that? Well, my neighbor just said that we have to find local solutions. I personally think that the issue of trust is a major issue. If we talk about the situation today, obviously I'm not bringing down the issue of poverty to the issue of what's happening in our suburbs and neighborhoods, but I tend to say that rather than finding immediate solutions, we'd have to say, okay, let's take a break. Let's take a step back. And let's take time to build the solutions with the people who are at stake. It's not for the political authorities, it's not for the experts to think of the solutions that have to be given to the poor people. In our countries, most of the citizens want to have a say in the topics that concern them. It's true for everyone, including for people who are in great poverty. Recently, in our council, we organized a citizen convention on the end of life with 125 people being drawn. And we made sure that several people in situation of great poverty were able to participate in the work. And when you create the right conditions, you realize that everyone, including poor people, can have a pertinent say and can be an actor in the topics that concern them. And this is very important. And when I was saying that we should take a step back or take a break, I may somewhat be provocative, but what I feel is that we've reached the limits of all these public policies that are aimed at reacting to a crisis or reacting to an immediate and burning issue. You have to have a long-term policy, starting by associating the people who are concerned. It's an act of trust. One of the forms of poverty is also when people show you every day that your word doesn't mean anything. You have to show these people that their word counts. I can see that time is passing, and I want to give the floor to the audience. So please wait for a microphone, introduce yourself, and ask your question.
English. Following what my colleague from Colombia said, I just want to pose a question. Why poverty and inequality have disappeared from the sustainable development debate? When poverty and inequality has to do a lot with sustainable development, not only because it can contribute to all the problems we have, but also because those are the poor people and the unequal people that live in unequal conditions are the ones who suffer the most from the consequences of climate change. So in this panel, I would like to pose the question, why poverty and inequality have disappeared? I haven't except on this panel, everybody talks about climate change, but nobody talks about poverty and inequality, and nobody talks about Latin America. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Oui, la question du changement climatique.
Yes, this issue of climate change, it is true, because people who are in great poverty are the first victims of climate change. It's true. Who wants to answer? Mrs. Vidal, you want to answer? Yes, I'm going to try and answer what Cecilia said, but I'm going to try and answer about the possibilities, because the others gave two answers, and I need to be able to have the same number of answers. As concerns the possibilities, I could very well say that we need to introduce the racial perspective in this discussion, but there are two things that are very important. I'm a cultural manager. I moderate a non-for-profit in cultural organization that is developing in this area where there's a high level of poverty, and we promote reading. We work in the educational field with 2,000 families to promote the development of a critical mind, of a creative mind, because this is very important for poverty, to fight poverty. In these families, we already have children who've entered university, and I'm absolutely convinced that this is going to change the fate of their family. In fact, it has. Some of them are already working with us. What I want to say is that it's very important for the states to identify organizations such as ours, because as Thierry was saying, it's not just something for the state. There are many organizations of civil society, and there's many of us in Latin America who, through their work, are helping to try and eliminate poverty at all levels. We can't replace the state, but we are helping change the mentalities. We are helping to give a right to culture, to promote some other rights, and we help people qualify for other types of jobs that are not necessarily racialized, because the technical training for jobs is also based on a racist basis. You're trained for basic services as a builder or to take care of a beauty parlor, but you're not trained in a job that might bring you more revenue. In Latin America, I remember a college that was working on extreme poverty. You were either poor or former poor. There was no other way to qualify yourself. The politics have to be defined in terms of positive actions. In the U.S., they think they're doing it, but they're not. And you have to think about this in the U.S., in France, because otherwise you are not closing the gap. And to come back to what Cecilia was asking, all this is linked to the environmental discussion. When you see the forced displacement and relocations due to climate change, for example, there's a lot of populations being moved. You're losing biodiversity, and this is totally linked to food safety. So all this is absolutely not separable, and this is part of the poverty. We can see that public policies are difficult to build and organize, and one of the criteria, one of the ingredients will be to fight climate change. Another question maybe, madam? Well, hello, and thank you very much for these interventions. We talked a lot about the working population's access to minimum wage. We'd like to talk about students. A lot of them are in a situation of poverty in France. despite some support. I'm thinking about the food banks, etc. But about 30% students here in France are below poverty threshold, and they have trouble accessing education, even though this is the category that represents the future of our society. So my question is the following. What future, what hope do you have for these youngsters, for these students? Who wants to answer? Adrian? Stéphane Carcillo? I would like to, but I don't dare anymore. I believe that you did identify one of the topics. Traditionally, we didn't help the youngsters because fighting against poverty was aimed at families and households. The fight against poverty went through families. It was families were supposed to support their children, while in the Nordic countries, for example, this is an individual support. You give support to students based on their situation, not that of their parents. And we have given support recently to youngsters who are unemployed and have no diploma. Now we're trying to continue helping these students. They're not considered as priority subjects because they're studying, and they are considered as future job holders. But in the meantime, it's not the case. So this is a transition. Okay, let me turn to Carole Karabashik. Youngsters are sometimes the first to be concerned by poverty, but they're also the first to give solutions. You gave the solution, Mrs. Al-Sharabati. Yes, I would like to say one word about the poor children, poor students in France. There's all the more poverty because in the southern countries, there's so much poverty that these students and youngsters tend to go to the northern countries and increase the poverty of the local youngsters. So there's a global vision to be had. How do the South and North countries interact with poverty? Because nowadays we are setting up new methods to mobilize civil society. And today in countries of the South, there's a neo-colonial precedence and proeminence of in poverty action. Very often the policies in the southern countries are based on those of the north and have absolutely no sensitivity, no reaction to the actual needs of the south, and they may have a more negative impact than a beneficial one. Okay, we have 5 minutes left, I believe. One last question. Well, I do not want to talk about the manifesto of the Communist Party, but we're talking about fighting poverty. Don't you think the issue is the system in which we live? Don't you think this is at the basis of everything? Can we really talk about fighting poverty if we haven't picked a system that which means exploiting human beings? I'm afraid we would need 2 hours to answer this question. So maybe Mr. Baudet wants to answer that very quickly. I'm not going to answer that question. Naturally, it's true we would need at least 2 hours, but what I can say is that we are in a more and more polarized society. Some populations who have been living side by side for a long time, and it is a problem if we start living face to face. So there's social cement is at stake. I like to make a parallel with health. We have discovered in our country that good health is not dependent on health policies. It depends on housing, the place where you live, etc., and the way you feed yourself. So if we want to look at poverty, we must have a global perspective that goes above and beyond the social welfare or the welfare state policies or the employment policies. this is not enough. And the second issue is would be to say that amongst the fragile populations, there's a lot of talent. I can see Saïd Amouche here, who is the founder of Mosaic HR, which is a recruitment office. You can get up, sir. And they are bringing out new talents in the difficult neighborhoods. I would like civil society, I would like companies to mobilize and help out. I'm convinced that if they work with companies like Mosaic HR or others, they can lead to the emergence of these talents. And to say, what the lady here said is very important. In the companies now, we talk about CSR, corporate social responsibility, and the environmental issues have been taken into account. But be careful that we do not look at things only under that angle. The social issues cannot be a byproduct of the environmental issues. Sorry for the questions we weren't able to take. I know that the Rencontres are here to lead to new exchanges outside the amphitheaters. Thank you very much, and let's stay with this.